Toronto Blue Jays logo for 2020. Oops! Here's the real logo. Toronto Blue Jays logo 2020 as the Blue Jays decide to play in Buffalo, not Pittsburgh. Hi everyone, this is Will O'Toole inviting you to another edition of Parks Ridge Sports History. I'd like to thank you again for allowing me to come into your homes and talk everything sports. This week I'd like to focus on not just opening day, but the Toronto Blue Jays decision not to play, the government of Canada really preventing them from playing. So the Blue Jays had to make a mad dash and find another ballpark where they could host their home games. And they decided not on Pittsburgh, but to play in Buffalo instead. And I'd like to take a point. It made me think, and of course, this is what always happens, but I start to think about this. There have been many moves or franchises that have moved from one place or one locale to another. And I was starting to think, I think it's been more successful of franchises moving from one place to another in terms of success, in terms of winning. So I'd like to take a look at some of the baseball moves that have occurred in the last century and a half in baseball history of franchises just moving, getting up one day saying, you know what, we're done with this city. Let's go to somewhere else where maybe we can be more prosperous. And of course, immediately we always think of the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants leaving the boroughs and moving out to the Gold Coast to Los Angeles and San Francisco. And really, when you think about it, initially for the Giants, it wasn't so successful, but you'd have to say in the last 15 years, the Giants have really succeeded in, the stadium by the Golden Gate. And of course, the LA Dodgers, we'll talk about them in a second, but, when LA moved out there, they'd only won one World Series prior to moving from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. As soon as they got out there, they won in 63, they won in 65. And they also won in 59. So they won in 59, 63, and 65. They won 3 times, basically in the space of 6 seasons, what it took them to do one time in about 6 decades of baseball in the National League. So let's just take a look at that. I'd also like to, as promised some of my followers, I'd love to focus a little bit. I kind of look at this as All-Star 2 weeks because when we were kids, and of course I'm going back a good 50 years, July seemed to always be these 2 weeks, the time when the All-Star game was played. I know it was played in the early 60s, even late 50s when they actually had 2 games. Sometimes it was played at the end of July. And then, of course, in 81, it was played in August. But when I was a kid, it was always these 2 weeks in July that they would set aside for the All-Star game. And the one in particular that really, besides 70 and 1969, the one that really stands out for me because it is so quintessential when you say the word All-Star game, it so embodies what the organizers of the All-Star game had in mind. All right. When Chicago sports writer, of course, I want to say it's Ring Lardner. I'm probably wrong saying that because it's the first name that occurs. But when he had the genesis for this game back in the 30s, 1933, he imagined all the great players from each individual team coming together and just putting on quite a show. Well, in 1971, for me, it was quite a show because there were a ton of future Hall of Famers in that game. And in that game, the future Hall of Famers were the real stars. And the ones that popped to your mind in the 70s, the Roberto Clementis, the Willie Mays, the Hank Aaron's, the Johnny Benches, they had quite a display of talent. And it was just a great game, even though my side lost. So I'd like to really cover a little bit more of that. And I'd also like to show you sometimes that you have to go to a number of sources before you kind of trust when you do the research. I'm going to get into that a little bit. But with the Blue Jays moving their games, it is going to be interesting that if the Blue Jays, and I'm kind of rooting for this now, if the Blue Jays manage to make it to the playoffs, will they stay in Buffalo or will they move the games to Toronto? Now you can say, well, they're not going to play in front of a crowd anyway. But just think about this. It still would do the local economy a world of good if the Blue Jays happen to get into the playoffs and maybe even in the World Series. It would be interesting to see if the politics would change and all of a sudden the Blue Jays would move the World Series back to Toronto. Right? That's a long way away, 6, 7, maybe 8 weeks. But until then, if you saw the cartoons, I had Toronto. Originally, they were going to play in Pittsburgh, which is why I have the Pittsburgh Steelers logo. I think that's become iconic, especially for the city of Pittsburgh. You put those 3 star-like things, the symbol of U.S. Steel up there, and everyone knows that you're talking about Pittsburgh. The second one, though, I really cobbled together the Buffalo Bill logo and the Toronto Blue Jay logo. I really like it only because when you look at the Buffalo, which I really enjoy, the Buffalo actually has a tuft of hair standing up similar to the feathers on the Blue Jay. So it kind of worked well for me. So Blue Jays are going to play their games in Buffalo. It'll do a wonder of goods, but it also makes me start to think this. Is baseball also thinking of, is this an experiment by baseball to ultimately move a franchise to Buffalo and see how conducive, how welcoming the city of Buffalo is? Now, again, I know fans won't be there, but it'll be interesting to see if Toronto, if they play well enough, can they just will the city of Buffalo embrace the Blue Jays? I happen to think they might, to the point where I could see baseball moving either Tampa Bay or Miami to Buffalo if this experiment, and it is an experiment, works out well for the league. Getting to that, here are 13 franchise movements in the history of baseball. And of course, I use, as I always tell you, I use Baseball Reference and Baseball Almanac as many of my sources for statistics. Sometimes I go to Wikipedia. Sometimes the 3 sources I combine. Obviously, sometimes Wikipedia gives you information that Baseball Reference or Baseball Almanac doesn't, and vice versa. But you still have to trust your sources. And today I'm going to point out a mistake that Wikipedia made in regards to the 1971 All-Star Game. But first franchise shift in baseball history, and this is, actually the website I'm using here is worldatlas.com, and they gave me the 13 because it's under sports. It's Milwaukee Brewers. No, not that Milwaukee Brewers, but the Milwaukee Brewers moved to St. Louis to become the St. Louis Browns back in 1902. And of course, when you see this, the moves of these franchises, you're going to realize that was probably the only move that did not pay dividends for the franchise. Because when Milwaukee moves to St. Louis was pitiful. The only season that they won a pennant was 1944. And in 1944, it was a war year, and I was reading some research on that Brown team. They apparently had quite a few. I'm not saying they're going to have the largest amount, but they had quite a few players who were 4F, who didn't qualify for the Army or the Navy. And so they were allowed to play baseball, of course, and they win the pennant. It's the first and only time in the Browns franchise history. One thing I did like about the Browns, I always tell you, I love the color orange, and they had an orange and brown uniform. Of course, I apologize. I was going to get some pictures. My computer's not working again with that, so I got to have my son here to help me figure it out. Anyway, Milwaukee moves to St. Louis. The Browns win in 44, but the Browns realize handwriting's on the wall, and they got to move their franchise. And of course, back in the 50s, as you'll see later, they moved to Baltimore, where they become more successful as the Baltimore Orioles. Of course, that was all under Bill Veeck's vision, I do believe. Speaking of the Orioles, the original Oriole franchise moved in 1903 to New York City to become the New York Highlanders, who later become the New York Yankees. Without a doubt, it's the greatest move of any franchise in the history of any North American sport. I can't think of any that's better than that, because the Yankees have gone on to win 27 World Series. They've been in 40 World Championship Series. And of course, they've been in divisional play, yada, yada, yada. Of course, you could argue they had probably, when you think about it, this would be a good argument. It's a great debate. Do the Yankees have the 4 most well-known players in the history of baseball on their roster? And the 4 I'm particularly talking about: Babe Ruth, who saved the game of baseball; Lou Gehrig, who unfortunately, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the disease that he suffered from, but they changed it to where they refer to it as Lou Gehrig's disease, the terrible disease that just eats away at your muscles, your nervous system, etc. Mickey Mantle, who was the icon of the 1950s. I mean, if there's one player who embodies the 1950s, and I know some people will argue Ted Williams, others will argue Willie Mays, but many people, when you think about it, when they think of the 50s, they think of the Eminem, Mickey Mantle, as being the icon, the quintessential player of the 1950s. And of course, before Mickey Mantle and after Lou Gehrig, you have Joe DiMaggio. Of course, there's a song that includes him, one of the great songs of the 1960s, Mrs. Robinson, which includes him. It's a pretty good argument that the Yankees, in addition to having all the championship banners, have probably the 4 most well-known players in baseball history. And as I said, you may get arguments from Giant fans with Willie Mays. All right, you might get arguments with Red Sox fans saying maybe Ted Williams, but maybe even some argument for Pete Rose. But those 4 players are probably the most well-known. And they're well-known just not in sports, but outside of sports. And I guess that's where I was driving at. That not only were they icons in the sports, but take them away, they were cultural figures as well. So it's an interesting. Anyway, Baltimore moves to New York, become the Yankees. Well, first, as I said, the Highlanders. And then you have the Boston Braves, who moved to Milwaukee. And people don't realize this, and of course, I'll forget this from time to time. Naturally, you think that when baseball moved west, go west, young man, that the Dodgers and the Giants were the first 2 franchises to do it, to take the risk. When in reality, it was the Boston Braves moving to Milwaukee. And of course, what I'd like to focus on is the fact that the Boston Braves only won 1 championship in 1914. They go out to Milwaukee and they win 2 pennants in 58, in 57 and 58, and 1 world championship. So you definitely are making a good argument when you say they really did the right move by moving from Boston to Milwaukee. And of course, they probably played second fiddle to the Red Sox all those years, even though it was rumored in the 60s that the Red Sox thought about moving their franchise as well. Fortunately, they didn't. And of course, they're the iconic team of New England. Anyway, the Boston Braves that year, they were 4th in runs scored, or runs per game. On their team, though, just to give you a little idea of who they were, the Braves scored runs per game. And remember, anybody who had the show last week when I did the whole anti-DH segment, and I mentioned that 1930s was the epoch for baseball scoring runs per game. The American League scored over 5 runs, as for their 8 teams. They scored over 5 runs per game. Better than that. I think it was 5.30. I don't have my little chart in front of me. And the National League was just underneath them. But then I had also mentioned that the interesting thing is the National League post DH has actually scored 0.10 more runs per game than they did in the other decades prior to it. And at the American League, yes, their offense has improved, but it has come nowhere near 1930. I think the highest that it got was 4.91 runs per game, and that was in the last decade, 2010. And now it seems to go down. As I made mention last week, runs per game, it seems to go up, then comes down, as almost it hits a high, and then the pitchers adjust, and adopt new strategies, and then it levels off again. And then the players do something different, or the league, like in the late 60s, do something to improve the hitting, or what they can do to improve the hitting, and it goes up. Now it's coming down, and I think one of the biggest reasons that it's coming down with the advent of the DH, the metrics that the players really haven't adapted to going the opposite of what they do, that they have to be more unorthodox. I know that sounds funny. They have to be more unorthodox in their hitting. So if they are a dead pull hitter, they have to learn to go the opposite way, or else they're not going to survive. And I love the fact that, and I think this is one of the things that real baseball fans love, and this is why they don't want regulations, is that for every time that the offense seems to get a step up on the defense or the pitcher, here come the pitchers and they do something else. Hey, how do we keep it in balance? And then the pitchers start to dominate, and then the players start to do something a little bit different. So, and it has shown the up and down, the up and down, the up and down. Anyway, that team in Boston, they were 4th in the league in runs scored per game. They did not have a guy. Well, I'm going to talk about this. I'm just going to go with the pitching as well. Boston's pitching that year, 3.47 runs allowed per game. Now, when they say runs allowed per game, they're not talking about ERA. The league average was 3.83. So they were almost half a point under the league average that year. So they had some brilliant pitching. And their hitting was 0.32 ahead of the league average, which was 3.84. Just to give you an idea who's on that roster for that Brooklyn or that Boston Braves team. They had a guy named Hank Gowdy. I did hear of him. Gowdy, I know, I can't remember. I know he was a catcher. And, of course, now my mind draws a blank with Hank Gowdy. But I know he had something to do with either a record or an invention in the game. I'll look that up. You know what? I just had a brain lock right there. They had playing first base Butch Schmidt. They had at second base Johnny Evers. And, of course, Johnny Evers is part of that poem, Tinkers to Evers to Chance. Well, he played for the Boston Braves, not the Chicago Cubs here, and he hit 279. Only one Brave regular on that team in 1914 hit above 300. Not one Brave had 100 RBIs. Actually, only one Brave had more than 75 RBI, and that was the next guy, their shortstop, Rabbit Marinville, who is in the Hall of Fame. He hit a lifetime 258. That year he hit 246. Charlie Deal was their third baseman, and then their outfield is Larry Gilbert, Les Mann, and Joe Connolly. And of course, Connolly was the one who hit 306. He had 28 doubles to lead the team with 10 triples, 9 homers, 65 RBIs, 12 steals. Balanced attack. If I'm looking for kind of an optimistic thing with the Braves, definitely balanced. No player superseding expectations, or no player having that monster year. Johnny Evers did lead the team in scoring with 81 runs. And they had only one player, a regular, come off the bench to hit 300, and that was Red Smith. No, not the writer, but it was Red Smith, the third baseman. And he managed to play 60 games that year. So I'm sure he saw utility duty as well. But no one hit over 10 home runs. And, of course, this was baseball's dead ball era. And if I can remember correctly, It was one of the low runs per game. In fact, that year in the National League, the National League only, as I said, was 3.84. So this was one of the low decades in terms of runs per game. Now, the Boston, here's what their pitching staff looked like. I know that I'm not going to know a lot of them, so I apologize that I don't know many of them. But they had two 20-game winners. Actually, they had two 25-game winners. 26-game winner Dick Rudolph, Bill James, who won 26-10, and Bill James, who was 26-7. No, not the metric guy, not the baseball analyst guy, Bill James, but pitcher Bill James. And Lefty Tyler, 16-13, along with Otto Hess, 5-6. Notice I only mentioned four, starting a rotation of four, but get this, complete games. Those four players completed 89 of the 154 games that they were in. And they threw collectively 16 shutouts. Their ERAs, Otto Hess had the highest ERA, 3.03. Lowest belongs to Bill James, 1.90. So this was definitely a team fashioned from defense and good pitching, and that was a 1914 team. Compare that, when I think about it, and compare that with the Boston Braves team of the 50s, where you had Hank Aaron and Eddie Matthews anchoring the offense. Together, they had over 1,200 home runs lifetime. And then you had Lou Burdette, and of course the great pitcher for the Milwaukee Braves. Oh boy, I am having a rough day here. Warren Spahn, who won 416 games. How the guy is on the tip of my tongue, and I can't think of him. I apologize for that. I just want to show you something about Warren Spahn. He was amazing. You know, we talk about those Braves team. You know, it was Lou Burdette, though, who won the 57 and 58 or the World Series for the Braves. He was tremendous in the postseason for the Braves in those World Series. But when you talk about a great lefty, first of all, Warren Spahn's WAR is 100.1. He won 363 games, lost 245, had an ERA of 3.09. Remember, though, that this was one of the high points in the 50s when he pitched in the National League in terms of runs per game. So you have to take that in consideration. Perhaps, and of course, this is always the if, what my one brother always says. It's the one word, maybe only two letters long, but it means so much. If maybe Spahn had pitched in a different generation, maybe he doesn't have a 3+ ERA. Maybe it's around 220. But I just want to show you this. Spahn, 20 wins in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 seasons. He won 20 or more games. And in fact, he won 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, in 11 of 13 years. And the 2 years that he didn't win, he was 14-19 with a 2.98 ERA and 17-14 with a 3.26 ERA. And that was 1955. And you know what? I would love to look this up. I know that so many, the metric guy today, are talking about how wins really don't count. Really? I think about this. If wins don't count, why is the name of the Pitcher's Award called Cy Young? That's number one. Number two, I don't think, without a shadow of a doubt, that players, when they go out and they play ball, have a different feeling when it's a Tom Seaver, a Bob Gibson, a Steve Carlton, a Warren Spahn, when they take the mound, as opposed to, let me just see, Rick Harden, Jim Hand, Jim Schellenbach, all right, Jim Panther. These are guys that just picking off the top of my head, the pitch for the centers and stuff. Tell me, which one do you feel most that you're going to win? Psychologically, I think that starting pitchers, especially when they are big-time winners, I think they carry quite a bit of strength and confidence in the players behind them. And if you notice, many of these guys, you watch Sandy Koufax or Don Drysdale, Bob Gibson is quintessential of this. They throw rapidly. And I don't mean that they're throwing all over the place. They have a fast rhythm. And it never allows their defensive players to not be on their toes. They're always waiting for that next pitch, always into the game, always in it. There's no slow delivery. I think that's one of the biggest problems with some of these pitchers that struggle today. They take forever to throw the baseball. Those guys just reared back and fired, but they knew that they were doing. It wasn't just throwing it for the sake of throwing it. But if you take a look, Warren Spahn was the same. I know that Tom Seaver, just give me the ball, throw the ball. Bob Gibson, never did he have a conversation. He resented it when a catcher came out, even if it was Tim McCarver, to talk to him. He knew what his job was. So that 57-58 Braves team, I'm going to just focus on that 57 team because they won and they moved from Boston in 53. But put it this way. In 56, they won 92 games. In 55, they won 85. In 54, they won 89. In 53, their first season in Milwaukee, they won 92. All right? Their last season in Boston, won 64 games. They were 25 under 500. They immediately go out to Milwaukee. Yes, they get better players maybe. They brought some players up, but still, maybe the change of scenery. They win 92 games, 89 games, 85, 92. And then in their World Series, when they won the World Series 4-3 over the Yankees, they won 95. And then they repeat as the NL pennant winners. They win 92. Then they win 86. Then they win 88. And of course, kind of the franchise goes down. And then they move to Atlanta prior to the 66 season. Let me just go here. So we have Boston moving to Milwaukee. Then we have the Browns, of course, moving to Baltimore in 54. And of course, even though Baltimore wasn't good in the 50s, they were growing a crop of good young pitchers like Palmer. There was a guy named Wally Bunker. Well, he blew out his arm, but had some good seasons there. They had a guy named Steve Barber who could have been more effective. Again, bum arm. But then they acquire the Cuellar. They bring up Palmer, who had a bum arm, but recovered from that as well. They get Cuellar. They had McNally. And, of course, as I stated in a couple episodes ago, they get Pat Dobson, and they get 4 20-game winners by 1971. But St. Louis moves to Baltimore, and in 1966, they win the World Series. They are pennant contenders again in 67 and 68, although in 68 they kind of bottom out, but it gives rise to Earl Weaver. 69, they win over 100. I think they won 109 that year. In 70, I think they won 108. And in 71, they won over 100 games. I think they won with the 4 20-game winners. I'm going to say like 109 again. So in 3 years, Weaver won over 300 games, won a World Series. Then in 72, they win the AL East. 73, they win the AL East. 72, Detroit wins. Pardon me. 73, they win the AL East. 74, they win the AL East. And then they come back in 79 and 83 to win the pennants. And in 83, of course, they win the World Series. I think it was an outstanding move that the Browns move and become the Baltimore Orioles. And, of course, one of my favorite logos. All right. So they move in 1954. Philadelphia A's moved to Kansas City after years and years being in the basement in Philadelphia, simply because Connie Mack refused to pay the players. Remember that 29, 30, and 31 team. You had Al Simmons, you had Jimmy Fox, you had Lefty Grove on those teams, and he simply didn't want to pay the players, and then he just sold them off. And then really Philadelphia bottomed out. They never were the same team. Mack does manage that team for 50 years, sometimes in a suit jacket and coat. or a suit and tie rather. And they just decide, though, fan interest. It was really, it's interesting. Even though the Phillies stunk all those years, not winning a pennant until 1950 and not winning their first World Series until 1980, they were still the love of the town, more so than the Philadelphia A's. And it's almost as if the A's had the same problem in Philadelphia, maybe with a love-hate relationship with Connie Mack. I'd like to investigate that a little bit more, but almost a love-hate relationship with Connie Mack as they did as the Charlie, the Oakland A's did with Charlie Finley. Brooklyn, of course, they win the World Series in 55, kind of like the Braves. They get back in 56 and lose. And then they decide they're moving prior to the 58 season. And like I said, they get out there. They win in 59 the World Series, beating the White Sox. They get out there. They sweep the Yankees in 63 with Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale. In 65, they go to 7 games before they beat the Twins, another team that had its franchise moved. And then in 66, they lose in 4 to the Baltimore Orioles, who had moved from St. Louis. So it's interesting how successful these franchises are, all in a glut. Now, you can also say the 50s, a lot of these teams moved west because of transportation, the advent of night baseball, just the growth of the sport. But remember, they don't really expand until 1961. So you're still dealing with 8 teams. And when you think about it, you have Philadelphia, Baltimore, Brooklyn, and New York, and Milwaukee. You have 5 of your 16 franchises moving in the decade of the 50s. Next, after the Dodgers, you have the New York Giants, who also moved the same year. It's a shame because, again, talking to my brothers who are big Mays fans, and they really know their baseball. But Willie Mays was never embraced in San Francisco, and I think he even kind of, you sense this, he was not embraced by the San Francisco fans as much as he was beloved by the New York fans. And it's a shame. I know I sound like a heretic saying this. It's a shame that Mays wasn't traded by the Giants, or, in 58, by 59, the Mets come into play. It's a real shame, because it would have been great to have Mays spend his entire career in New York City. Enough said on that. Frisco suffers. Remember, they were a franchise that was going to be on the move in the late 70s. They thought Marvin Davis was going to buy the team because, remember, they built that terrible Candlestick Park. It definitely had an effect on the statistics of Mays and McCovey. I would say that it probably cost 10% home runs, batting average to Willie Mays, RBIs, all this, etc. Probably if he had played, can you imagine if he had played in the park that Barry Bonds? Oof, in that ballpark. Mays, though, was definitely affected. It was one of the worst ballparks going. First of all, it was always cold. It was windy. And I think a lot of ball players, those are the 2 worst type of conditions a player can really let his skills out, when it's very cold and windy. It's nothing worse than the wind. And how many balls you might hit in the outfield that are blown back in because of the wind. Anyway, they're not successful. And remember that San Francisco was rumored, one of the places that were going to move was to Denver. That would have been interesting. And also to Toronto. But they did manage to stay in San Francisco. And it was a good thing for the Giants, because in the decades of 2010, they won 3 titles, which is about as many as they won when they were in New York. Their last one in New York was 1954, with the great Willie Mays making that unbelievable catch on Vic Wertz. But the Giants had won in 1905. I'm just running through this. They won in 21 and 22 with some great teams there. All right. But and they win again in 1933, and then nothing. The Yankees dominate. If you're a New York fan, it's the Yankees that you're rooting for. The next team of the 13, the Washington Senators move to become the Minnesota Twins. Now, the Washington Senators do win a World Series, 1924. But making the move to Minnesota, hey, they won in 1987 and 1991. But between winning in 24 and in 33, there's nothing there. 30 years of nothing. The Twins do win the pennant in 65. May have had a chance to win the whole thing in 65 had they not run into the buzzsaw called Sandy Koufax. And it has done baseball a world of good to have a team out in the Midwest like that. Calvin Griffith moved the team, and they become really that whole area, Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, embraced the team. One of the first teams named after the state, if not the team named after a state instead of a city, the Minnesota Twins. It's another logo I love. Then in 1966, what happened was, after the great 50s run by Milwaukee, I think they kind of panicked and the franchise went down a little bit. They kind of got old fast. Warren Spahn was older, Lou Burdett was older. It was still prime for Hank Aaron. They didn't put more pieces together to surround Matthews and Aaron. Of course, Adcock was older as well. So they decide really, this was definitely a business decision, but they move to Atlanta. And I think really what they saw was this, that the South, remember, there's no team really when you think about it, south of the Mason-Dixon line, with the exception of maybe Baltimore, and if you want to include St. Louis. So they saw maybe Atlanta as maybe becoming the regional team for Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And so they moved the franchise to Atlanta. They are not successful at all, with the 1 year being 1969, when baseball split into 4 divisions. You have the American League East and West, the National League East and West, plus they expanded with Montreal and San Diego. And the Braves win that first year, but they went down 1-2-3 to the Mets. And they weren't successful really until Bobby Cox arrives. And then they just go on that full ride. So that's an interesting one. They've won 1 World Series in Atlanta. They won 1 in Milwaukee. They won 1 in Boston. That one is an incredible debate. Were they better off staying in Milwaukee, or have they been better off moving to Atlanta? I guess you'd have to say Atlanta, because they become really one of America's teams. Then you have Kansas City moving. Remember that Philadelphia moves to Kansas City in the 50s. I don't know whether I mentioned that. But then they become the Oakland A's in 68. Charles Finley again. I think he saw something there. You have to remember this, in Kansas City, and this was before Finley arrived, Kansas City had taken its licks from the press, from baseball in general. They had a reputation of feeding the New York Yankees lust for championships by becoming almost like a feeding team and trading with the Yankees, the Roger Marises, and other players that the Yankees used to pluck off the Kansas City roster. And I think that had a psychological effect on them. Plus, here's the other thing. I think Finley was brilliant this way. He saw what a good team he had in this Kansas City A's group in 1967 and decides to move them. Remember, he had fashioned that team. He had Reggie Jackson. He had Sal Bando. He had Bert Campaneris. While he was in Kansas City, Campaneris played 9 positions in 1 game. I think he's also one of 2 guys that hit 2 home runs in a game and also 2 triples in a game. So I think he has that record as well on separate instances. But he had Vida Blue coming up, Catfish Hunter. He had a wealth of talent, and maybe the move really kind of opens it up, kind of like a brand new thing. This untapped talent now is allowed to flourish without any kind of reputation that they had in Kansas City. Then, of course, Seattle, one of the great one-year wonders in my mind, 69, Seattle Pilots, one of the greatest books, if not the greatest book written about baseball, Ball 4 by Jim Bouton. Talks about his year with both Seattle Pilots and the Houston Astros. They decide, because of money, they're going broke, that they moved to Milwaukee. And they basically moved almost on opening day. But I think that was a better move for the team. Within 12 years, they're playing in a World Series. Baseball is happy because they get a franchise back after Milwaukee had sued when the Braves left. So Seattle to Milwaukee. And then the Washington Senators, after the end of the 71 season, pack up and move to Texas. Again, I think this was another team that saw that the franchise just wasn't going to be successful no matter what they did in Washington, and said, you know what, maybe we just need a new beginning. And so they moved to Texas. Now, they struggled in Texas, but at least they get to the World Series and lose two really, really tragic kind of World Series to St. Louis and to San Francisco. But at least they were winning there. And they were getting a new park this year after having a new old park last year. But they move. And then, of course, Montreal to Washington. Washington wins the World Series. They struggled while the team was in Montreal. Years and years, Montreal would have some good teams, but they never could get all the pieces together. And, of course, politics, bureaucracy, lack of funds leads the team to sell, and they move to Washington. And I think winning a world championship like they did last year, I think the franchise is going to be successful. I think it's also good that Washington is in the National League instead of the American, and kind of is that rival to an American League team. They're not playing second sister like maybe the Senators were all those years to Baltimore. So those are your moves in baseball with the franchises. And just talking about the 71 World Series, 71 All-Star game, because I have last couple minutes. At 71 All-Star team, this is where I say that you have to be careful. The game was marked by home runs galore. These are the guys that hit the home runs. Johnny Bench, Hall of Famer. Hank Aaron, Hall of Famer. Roberto Clemente, Hall of Famer. Reggie Jackson, Hall of Famer. Frank Robinson and Harmon Killebrew, all Hall of Famers. The National League only had 5 hits. The American League had 7. And as I mentioned in one of my previous shows, Doc Ellis was the first guy in a while to lose the All-Star game and also Game 1 of the World Series in the same season. What I didn't realize that Mickey Loach was credited with the first save in All-Star history, and what was nice is that he did it in his hometown fans. There are only 2 other hits in this game, and people don't realize this. And they were by non-Hall of Famers. One was, Johnny Bench had 2 hits, but he was a Hall of Famer. The only other hit by the National League was by Willie Davis. Wikipedia has it as Tommy Davis. They're 2 totally different players. And the other guy that had a hit, who's not in the Hall of Fame, you Yankee fans will love this, was Bobby Mercer, who was the heir apparent to center field and Mickey Mantle. Tragedy struck, of course, with the brain cancer with Mantle. Mantle was a really good player. I think, though, playing in the shadow of Mantle really hurt his career. But he had some good years with the Yankees and actually started a couple of All-Star games in a Yankee uniform. But the only other hitter to have a hit for the National League was Willie Davis. And why I mention Willie Davis is this. It's not Tommy Davis. The Wikipedia has it as Tommy Davis. Well, listen, everybody makes mistakes, but this is why I like to go to a couple of sources with it. But just take a look at some of the players that were in this World Series, in this All-Star game. See, even I made a mistake there. You had Hall of Famers, including Mays, Aaron, Joe Torre. Now, Torre, I know, makes it as a manager, but he had an MVP season that year. Santos, Stargell, Brock, McCovey, Marichal, Bench, can't say Rose, Fergie Jenkins on the National League side. The American League side had Carew, Carly Yastrzemski, Frank Robinson, who hit a home run and became the first one to homer in both leagues in an All-Star game. Al Kaline, Harmon Killebrew, Brooks Robinson, Louis Aparicio, Reggie Jackson, Jim Palmer. And then you had Juan Marichal, and also, that was it, Juan Marichal. And your managers were Sparky Anderson and Earl Weaver. This is Will O'Toole thanking you again for welcoming me into your homes. I'll see you next week with another Sports History